We began this evening with the economic crisis. Stocks plunged at the end of the day in response to fears that the financial crisis is intensifying. The Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped 7.3%, falling below the 9,000 mark for the first time since 2003. General Motors sank to its lowest value in 58 years, losing $2.15 to close at $4.76 per share. In all, $900 billion was wiped off the value of U.S. equities. As one analyst told Bloomberg News, people have lost faith in everything. We're dealing with an investment community of atheists right now. Valuations no longer matter. Today's losses come after a series of emergency measures, including coordinated efforts by central bankers to cut interest rates. Secretary of the Treasury Henry Paulson suggests the Treasury Department is considering buying stakes in troubled banks by the end of the month. Joining me now is Paul Volcker. He served as chairman of the Federal Reserve from 1979 to 1987. He is known for raising interest rates to historic highs in order to combat rising inflation. This move ultimately steered the economy into a prolonged period of growth. Earlier this week, he commented on the current financial crisis, saying, quote, "The earth has moved and the system is reorganizing itself under great pressure." He has been said by one Fed historian to be the last god of central banking still standing. I am pleased to have him here. He is about to leave, and the opportunity to talk with him is something that I've wanted to do very much. So I am pleased to have him here. I don't have any fancy questions. I just want to know how you see the world that we're going through and what we have to do.
Well, I think it's clear that this crisis is at a rather critical point. Up or down, over, where are we going? And it's reached a point, you see it in the stock market, obviously, the figures that you reflected, but it's more important what's going on in the credit markets, where the arteries of credit are pretty well clogged up in many cases, and that reflects back on the economy. The economy, kind of surprisingly, has escaped any great damage until now, but it's quite, except for the housing, obviously. But it's quite clear, I think, we're going to be in a recession. State and local governments are hurting. Financially, they're going to have trouble. So I think we're at a critical point. But what strikes me when I sit back a little bit and try to look at this is, I think finally we have the tools in place potentially for dealing with this. There's some very extraordinary measures taken over a period of time. You step back and look at where we are now, I think governments have the tools to deal with this. Now, what am I talking about? Yesterday, we had a drop of central bank rates of, I don't know how many central banks, but
yeah, I think there were 5 or 6, including the People's Bank of China, including Bank of England.
It was pretty much across the board,
European
which
Union
reflects
banks.
an understanding which was not here a few weeks ago, that this is an international problem. There was a lot of schadenfreude in Europe about the United States. No more, because their banks are in trouble. And they've come to the conclusion they want to work together. And of course, they're in Washington. And I think maybe the most important single thing there is every one of these countries, these important developed countries, have said, one way or another, we're going to protect the principal international banks that are in our country. And those banks are the backbone of the system. And it's pretty clear they're going to be protected. Secretary Paulson made that pretty clear in terms of the United States. The British acted yesterday with a lot of money. Other countries have acted. Belgium, Holland, French talk about putting money in. So that's going to be done. In the United States, the other banks, the FDIC is there. We raised the deposit limit. There's a lot of source for some confidence there. We have the $700 billion package, which is available for putting capital into banks to the extent it's needed, and Secretary Paulson emphasized that yesterday. It's available for helping to liquefy the mortgage market. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are able to buy some more mortgages. The Federal Reserve's taken action to get the commercial paper market, which is coming to a standstill, moving. We've got guarantees for money market funds. And maybe one of the most important things kind of hidden in public is clearing up the clearance and settlement and so-called netting arrangements for these credit default swaps.
Right.
Only out there in $60 trillion that were out there. This is really important because it eats up money, it eats up collateral, and you can't clear it up overnight. But they're working on it. So I think we have the tools, and if we get the leadership and get together and push internationally, we ought to be able to deal with this. I don't like to see all this intervention. It's disturbing that we had to do it. But we had to do it. The tools are there. And let's get this thing settled and keep the recession as limited as we can do it. And then we're going to have to rebuild the system.
Why hasn't any confidence come back? I mean, all these tools are in place. Yet you saw what happened to the market today, and there is no credit. Nobody is lending, and even interbank, no lending, because they don't trust that bank may go insolvent.
That's right. And that's what, deal number one for the big banks,
exactly.
As I mentioned. Why?
We've had these measures.
Yeah, but
we know they're out there.
This problem is bigger than we imagined generally when it started. And it's been dealt with piecemeal. I don't say that critically, but it's been dealt with. Bear Stearns was taken care of, and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were taken care of. Then they thought goodbye with Lehman, and then AIG goes, and then Morgan Stanley and
Goldman Sachs
had to take action. And coming out, and then there's a big fight in Congress about the so-called bailout plan, which wasn't confidence building. So the way all these things came out, it looked like, in a way, nobody was in charge. Nobody had a full panoply of measures. So the point I'm making is that they are really there.
Yeah, they are now there. I mean, it looked like they were going from emergency to emergency,
right, exactly.
and putting your hand in the dike here and there, rather than having a plan to deal with the problem in its entirety.
We need the plan. The tools are there for the plan, putting it together. And putting it together in an international context, I think, is a plus.
Okay, let me talk about what you mean there. I mean,
is a plus.
Okay, let me talk about what you mean there. I mean, we had this coordination by the central banks in terms of everybody lowered their interest rates. What else do you mean by coordination? How do they coordinate?
Well, the coordination doesn't depend, I think, upon specific common actions, and you won't get common actions in the way individual finance ministries deal with their banks. But I think they all recognize there has to be some balance here. We don't want a feeling of trouble in one area and everybody runs in another area. As happened, it seems kind of trivial almost, the Irish decided they would guarantee all their bank deposits. So the British worried that bank deposits would run from London to Dublin.
Well, they were. They had started.
And they had started. The volume can't be that big.
Yeah.
But that's... we don't want competition between the continent of Europe, between London and New York. We'd rather create the impression that all of them are working together to protect particularly the major banks.
Well, as you know, the G7 is in Washington, the IMF is in Washington, they're all meeting.
So this is an opportunity to make sure that they're all on the same track.
But is it just talking to each other, or is it coming together and say, let's all do this? 1, 2, 3.
Well, I think it's all coming together and saying, yes, we're all going to protect our big banks, coming together and saying, as yesterday, we're going to have a common response in terms of monetary policy, which I don't think is particularly, it's important that symbolically they came together.
Right.
But the monetary policy is not the heart of the problem now.
Yeah. But did it help a little bit, or is it just an example to show coordination?
Yes, I think without question. But again, that came out kind of piecemeal, but it's important. But I think more important is the fact that all of them now admit or own up to the fact their own banks are going to need support. And I think that helps if they take the right measures. Now, different countries are going to approach it differently because they have different laws, but the object is the same. And I think the result will be the same, that people can stop worrying about whether New York or London or Frankfurt or Paris or something is in trouble in terms of big banks. They've all got problems, and they're all going to deal with them.
Okay, let me just, a couple of points. You seem to say, look, all those steps taken might have been done if they were done together in a coordinated way, those steps by the United States, by the Fed, and working with Treasury, that they were the right things to do Basically, you're saying that. I don't have any problem, Paul Volcker, with the steps, and I think they were all necessary.
Yeah, but you couldn't. It was unrealistic to say at the beginning of this crisis, a year ago, they were going to drag out all the ammunition, all the tools, and say, we're full speed. Obviously, they reacted to a particular problem at a particular time. But there was, I think, some loss in credibility in the way that it came about. And now I think
because they didn't deal with, say, compensation of executives or oversight or some of those issues, or maybe increasing the FDIC.
I think those are the long-term issues.
Right.
Those are the issues that have to be dealt with. We want to come out of here with a financial system that will have flexibility, it will have openness, it will be innovative, but it can't be the fragile system that we put up with in recent years that jeopardizes the whole economy. We can do better than that.
If we don't do something, how long before it will hit the real economy?
It's hitting the real economy now.
So that's jobs, and that's people who have to meet payrolls, and that's people who can't get loans from the bank to meet their obligations.
We've clearly reached that point. And that's why we're at this kind of critical juncture. But now is the time. It's not just a financial problem. We've got to deal with the financial problem, partly because it's hitting the real economy. Partly because it's hitting the real economy. And I think it's inevitable we're going to have some kind of a recession, but is it going to be a big recession or is it going to be a manageable recession? That's still open.
Will it be the closest thing we have seen in this country to the Great Depression?
I don't think it's going to be the Great Depression.
I didn't say that. I said the closest thing we have seen
to. Well, the closest thing we have seen. That is so far distant from anything else we have seen, with 20% unemployment or more for years. We're nowhere near that. And we haven't been anywhere near that in the post-war period. We've had concerns that I didn't understand a few years ago that we might have a Great Depression. And we bent over backwards to ease money for reasons I didn't understand, because I didn't think it was a real threat.
The question often is asked, why didn't a lot of people see this? Why didn't they know that we were creating these securities, mortgage securities, that were taking us down this road? I mean, I even read today in the New York Times somebody saying, I don't think many people even today know what the risk is of some of those securities and where they are. Now, I don't know whether that's true or not, but that was a story.
There's no question.
And they can't put a value on them. They don't know what the exposure is.
Absolutely.
You know, and that's why people are scared to lend money, because they don't know what's going on out there, and they don't know where. Here's what.
Absolutely.
You know, and that's why people are scared to lend money, because they don't know what's going on out there, and they don't know where. Here's what former chairman of the Federal Reserve said in 2005, February 11th, 2005, quote, there are really disturbing trends, huge imbalances, disequilibria, risk. Call them what you will. Altogether, the circumstances seem to me as dangerous and intractable as any I can remember. This is 2005, and I can remember quite a lot. I don't know whether change will come with a bang or a whimper, whether sooner or later, but as things stand, it is more likely than not that it will be a financial crisis rather than policy foresight that will force the change. This kind of, that's you.
That's where we
February
are.
2005. What you said then is happening.
I think that's a fair comment.
September, October 2008.
Right. Well, this crisis really began, of course, in 2007, and it's only revealed in its full immensity now in October of 2008.
There are people who say perhaps there ought to be another line of attack, which is to buy up the mortgages.
Well, I think that's part of it. I mentioned that this $700 billion program, the debate was largely around that subject. And there have been a number of proposals for how to go about this.
Right.
It's not easy, but that is the core of the $700 billion program.
To buy mortgage securities, those are the, you know how the discussion has gotten, so they talk about toxic assets, and they're saying you'll buy up. You know.
Well, buying up the individual mortgages is probably not much of a problem. Those that are still individual mortgages held by banks, those are probably the better credits. The bad credits are all packaged in these so-called CDOs and CMOs, where it's hard to extract individual mortgages. And that is a technical challenge that the Treasury is going to have to deal with in implementing the so-called bailout program. That is a very difficult technical problem. It there are two things involved here. One is getting the mortgage market more liquid and getting some of the toxic waste. The other is dealing with the
toxic
homeowners.
stuff out of the system.
Yeah, but we've got to deal with the homeowners, those that have mortgages they can't handle, not just the speculators, but the people who thought they were doing the right thing and building or owning a house and buying a house, and they got put in over their heads. And dealing with that on a mortgagor by mortgagor basis is a formidable challenge.
And impossible?
Well, I don't think it's impossible, but that's, various proposals have been made for easing it. I got a proposal the other day from a thoughtful guy who had an idea that if we marshaled the judicial power in the United States, it's kind of using the judges as arbitrators and mediators, we could get after this. Maybe that's a good idea, but some way you've got to get through this. The mortgagor, I think, has to take some initiative, and then somehow you've got to deal with the trustee that is responsible for all these packages of mortgages, and he has to have the ability to negotiate. That may take a change in the law. I'm not sure there's controversy about this, but you have to be empowered. The trustee has to be empowered to make the deal.
Take a look at this. You saw a conversation I did with Warren Buffett. Take a look at this. Here it is. Roll tape.
I don't think it would be crazy to have a model or an entity model on the Reconstruction Finance Corp. That goes back to 1932, although it was really implemented in 33 under Jesse Jones. And it invested in mostly banks initially and preferred stock and that sort of thing. So there are two things needed in the system. The one that's needed overwhelmingly is liquidity. I mean, when people are trying to do leverage, there has to be somebody there to buy. And they don't have to buy it at fancy prices, but to buy. And then there's also a capital problem with some of the institutions. We have provided capital here with a couple of institutions recently. The federal government did that in the 30s through the RFC, and I think there could well be a proper role for government in that.
He, in substance, is saying the same thing I'm trying to say, probably less articulately. I think it is unfortunate that in developing a $700 billion program, which can do both of the things that he is talking about, there wasn't more of an institutional structure. Now, that takes time, but it doesn't have to take a lot of time, that you have a little separate instrumentality, which was what the RFC was.
Right.
And then Jesse Jones went in there and ran it, and he had his own staff, and they largely put preferred stock in the banks, which is one thing that we have the capacity of doing now. And it's going to be done directly by the Treasury under the existing law. And it also has the capacity to use that $700 billion for helping to liquefy the mortgage market. And I think the emphasis is moving more toward making sure you can adequately capitalize the banks and less toward the direct purchase of mortgage.
I hear you, and I think that's true from my observation, people I talk to. I mean, in this rush to liquidity, people want to get their money out of institutions because they worry. They want liquidity. Where is all that money going? I mean, it's not all going to T-bills, is it?
Well,
a lot of it is. But
you get these situations where people don't trust their so-called counterparties, and so they sit on their money.
It's the next thing. It's the next thing to the mattress.
Yes, and they try to put it in government securities and the short term. They don't even like to put it in long-term government securities. They put it in very short-term government securities, and the interest rate is practically nothing. Some of them run into gold, but the point is there is a lack of trust. And let me go back, and this is the opportunity or the necessity. You've got to restore some sense of trust that the banks are able to meet their obligations. And that other, flowing out from that other financial institutions are able to meet their obligations. That, unfortunately, takes government support at this point. I hate this business where the government has to step in to protect the private market, but we're there. And let's do it.
Because there's a larger goal.
You know, there's a larger goal. We want to stabilize the economy. And let's get in there, get it done, and then we'll rebuild the financial system.
In January, with a new Congress.
Financial system.
In January, with a new Congress and a new president, what kinds of things? Lots of talk about regulation. Talk to me about what you think ought to be done there and what else.
Well, let's make two distinctions about what is being done and what should be done, because the market is reorganizing itself. Look, we all talked about the proud operators in the market in recent years have been those 5 great investment banks. They're all gone. You know, it's a revolution. And the tendency is for the big banks to get bigger. For you run to strength, and size seems to be strength.
Citicorp and Wachovia, or now Wells Fargo in the mix, and all of that. That
provides some stability. At some point, I think we're going to have to say, you know, a lot of big may be too big, and try to make sure that there are other lively competitors in the market. And I think in the United States, you have a great advantage. You know, there's still thousands of community banks and regional banks, and I think they need to be protected and supported so that we have that kind of competition. Then you have the hedge funds and the equity funds, which have been free of regulation. I think they, at the extreme, particularly the hedge funds, are going to be subject to some kind of regulations on leverage. And
about regulations on short selling.
And short selling is a very complicated subject. But how are we going to regulate those big banks is an important subject. And I think we can develop more effective regulation than we've had in past years. It's not going to be perfect.
The irony of all this, all these big commercial banks, you know, had hedge funds under their umbrella, did they not?
Well, it's a question whether that should happen. One of the problems with these big institutions is they're hard to manage just because they're so big. That's demonstrable. They also are filled with conflicts of interest. Should these big institutions have hedge funds under their umbrella? Should they have an investment management arm under their umbrella? And I think that has to be looked at to see how we can reconcile size with competition.
Was Glass-Steagall, the changing of Glass-Steagall, a mistake?
I don't. You know, technology had changed so much, I think it was sort of inevitable. But we have not adapted really the regulatory system and regulatory attitudes toward the world we now have. We didn't adapt it. Obviously, those big investment banks were not adequately supervised and regulated in terms of what they came to be doing. They may have been adequately regulated by 1970 standards, but not by 2007 standards.
Yeah. And people who took note of that, you and Warren Buffett both, in his letter to the stockholders, people who took note of that, it was like nobody was listening because they were making so much money.
Nobody listens when things are going well. That's what I was trying to say in this quotation. You know, so long as the Chinese were lending us money, money was very cheap. We keep the housing thing going by subprime mortgages, putting people in houses. What's to worry about? It all looked great. But, of course, it was unsustainable.
You were well connected in certainly Japan and also China. Are they going to continue to lend us money?
Well, I mean, I think the answer to that is yes, but because, you know, their alternatives are limited. But one looks at this over a period of time, the dollar serves an important function as a world currency. And it helps us, it helps other countries. If there's a lack of faith in the dollar, I think our problems are more complicated. And you won't get the kind of cooperation and coordination we were talking about earlier. Now, you know, it's interesting.
The kind of global coordination that's necessary to deal with the problem because of the dollar is less likely to get the kind of cooperation that's necessary?
Well, I think now the dollar is still the world currency, for better or worse. It's been very unstable, but it's interesting. In the midst of this crisis, people, when they get in trouble, they still want to run in the dollars. And that is very helpful, and it's a calming influence amid this crisis. But in time, if we are continuing relying upon foreign borrowings, I believe will not be true. The dollar will be chronically weak, and people will drift off into other monetary arrangements. It's a very complicated subject, obviously. Now, we don't want that to happen. The United States is still the biggest, strongest, most vital economy, and if that strength is reflected in a strong external position, It's in everybody's benefit, but it's important that that happens.
There are some people who look at this, as you said, they now experience their own problems, but in certain places where it's been less so, let's say Brazil or Latin America, they're sort of saying America's getting its comeuppance.
Well, there was a lot of schadenfreude. I think you don't hear that so much now, because they're in trouble.
Right.
For a while, it was fun to kind of, with some justice too, to criticize the United States.
What's going to be different once we get our hands around this? Is Wall Street going to be different? Obviously, the structure is going to be different, but is it really going to be different?
Well, I don't know what you mean by different. We're going to have a financial system, and I hope it works more efficiently and more effectively.
Because of?
Because of this crisis.
Right. No. And because of regulation and because of whether we create more distinction.
We built an extremely flimsy superstructure. I think of the financial markets that we built up are kind of a Potemkin village. It's $60 trillion worth of nominal insurance against credits, and they only had 10 trillion of credits. I mean, what's going on here? Why do we need 60 trillion of protection? Because people are trading with each other, speculating in effect, and in trading markets, trying to make some money. And now when people have questions, it begins to clog up the system, because all the money needs margin requirements, needs collateral. It's kind of a dead use of credit and dead use of liquidity to have to be margining all these requirements. And that's where we are. We're stuck.